Welcome to FP&A Fast Track, your source for FP&A resources to put your career on the fast track. Welcome, everybody. I have a great guest with me here today, Soufyan Hamid, and I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then I will let him expand a little bit because he has an extensive background. So I'll let him tell us about the things that he's more focused on today. So he is a finance owner of the School Finance Circle and a keynote speaker. So with that, if you could just tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now, who you serve, and then we can backtrack and get to a little bit of how you got there.
Yeah, first, thanks for welcoming me in your show, John. I'm happy to be there. And yeah, that sounds a bit weird when you say that, when you welcome someone working in finance and that presents himself as a trainer, owner, and a keynote speaker. But there's a story behind that. And
I get it though. Same, right?
Right, indeed, because I have worked in finance during 17 years, but it's true that 2 years ago, I decided to make a switch and to train finance professionals in many topics, mostly related to soft skills, but most importantly, in the world of storytelling. And this is my specialty today. I decided to really specialize in this because in the last years of my career in FP&A, I decided to create a methodology that worked for me because I considered myself as not being great at that time. And I created that. And after seeing that it was working really fine with me, I decided to test it in the world and to share it with the community. So that's why today, indeed, I have my school that I call the Finance Circle, and that trains not only companies, so FP&A teams, finance teams, but also individuals through online courses.
Very cool. So, like I said, you and I, same in the sense that we came from that finance and FP&A background and we got into training. I got into training initially because it was brought to my attention that my communication skills were not as good as I thought they were. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it took me down the rabbit hole of personal development. And then I realized maybe I can help other people with the challenges I had, but with sharing some of the lessons learned. So was there like a trigger moment like I had where somebody brought it to my attention, or was it more of a progression that led you to make that transition to the training side?
Yeah, we've had the same story, John, I think. Because I come from a really technical background because I started my career at PwC as an auditor. Then I moved to consulting at Deloitte. So I worked in big four companies during 8 years. And those are pretty technical. They teach you a lot to perform your work the best you can. And this was an incredible school. But when I moved to FP&A and working as a finance business partner, I quickly saw the limitations of only having technical skill. And I saw that in the first month, because in the beginning, I could be quite impressive for the people. They didn't know anything about Power Query, Power Pivot. I had financial modeling skills, and it was quite impressive for them to see how the work could be automated. But that only impressed my finance colleagues because as a finance business partner, I had other people I had to work with. And those were people from the business. In my case, it was a marketing department, a product ownership department. And I quickly realized that contrary to some of my colleagues, I was not invited to meetings. I was not warned when there was an important project coming up. So I realized that I was not the partner that I hoped to be. And I didn't know what to do until the day my finance VP in my company, well, during the monthly results presentation, we always had to present him the results so that he could present them to the exco. And each month it was a struggle. It was a struggle because he asked questions, he didn't understand what I wanted to share. He digged a bit deeper, he dived a bit deeper. And ultimately, at the end of the meeting, it was exhausting and a bit frustrating. And I think that and one day he just couldn't take it anymore. And he told me in these exact same words, Soufyan, you're an expert and you're talking to me like I was the same expert. But you have to realize that you have your specialty, you have your expertise, and the people in front of you will have others. So you have to
Yeah.
find a common ground. And instead of telling me what you had to do, tell me a story of what I have to remember. And
Mm.
this was the first time I heard about stories in finance. For me, it was stories. You heard that in a movie, in the Hollywood stories, or
Yeah.
even sometimes when you speak about people who just want to make pretty something that's not pretty. And
What I found came to mind when I would bring up stories is people think of it like more as in the context of entertainment, not educating or informing or sharing insights, right? It seems like a disconnect, I think, for some people
indeed,
that don't
indeed.
understand it.
And it took me time to realize that because at that time I still was considering he wanted me to cover the reality. But anyway, I took it as a challenge and I started to train. And I trained the best I could, but I was not always satisfied by the offer in the market because when I was looking for stories, I heard about TED Talks, I heard about Toastmasters, and they were great teaching me how to behave in a public speaking environment and giving me keys to understand how to speak to an audience, how to structure a story in general. But in my first tests, I realized that in the finance context, it needed some adjustments. And
Mm.
so I did not take it as such. I made some adjustments. I tested it. I took some slaps as well because it didn't work from the first step. And ultimately, after some time, I realized that people were asking me questions during the presentation. People were looking at me during the presentations and not looking at their laptops, sending an email or working in their
Ah,
spreadsheets.
these are good
So
signals.
yeah, it was a good signal. And I realized after 1 year or something like that, that a guy in a marketing offsite just told me after that, I had the impression that it was a marketing presentation. And I took
Mm.
that as a compliment because
I
I
was,
could,
that's what I was just thinking.
yeah, it was a compliment for me because he said that with a big smile, saying, okay, it was informative. I had the information I needed to have. And I go out of that with a clear action point and a clear change in my mind. So I realized, okay, you have the formula. So let's test it more and see if it works. And it continued working with different audiences. And so I told myself I need to share that. I cannot just
Yeah.
hold it for myself because I'm pretty sure that if I was in the case, many finance professionals were in the same case and still are
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. So as you were explaining that, what came to my mind initially was that curse of knowledge, right? That explains that we have this expertise and we sometimes fall into this trap of assuming whoever our audience is has the same expertise. And we use lingo. We say things like EBITDA and CAGR and all these acronyms that amongst our peers in finance works fine. But if we're talking to someone in marketing or IT or wherever it happens to be, they go over their head. And in some cases, they won't even ask us to explain. They just will be silent on it and they'll just move about their day. We assume they understood and they didn't. And then we have this big disconnect.
Mm.
You mentioned several times this framework that you created. And I've found for myself too that it seems like that expression about necessity is the mother of invention, right? It
Yeah.
sounds like that was your case. So talk to me a little bit about what is that framework and what was it that made you include those specific things in that framework that made it specific to finance, as opposed to like, what is that, Campbell's story, The Hero's Journey,
Yeah.
right? Which storytellers in entertainment use, but that's
Mm.
way too complicated and cumbersome, I found, for a business context. So let's talk about your framework. Tell me a little bit more about it.
Well, the first thing is that I will almost start with the end by saying that preparing the slides is only the last thing you do before practicing.
Yep.
While
Makes sense.
generally, in my experience and in the companies I've had contacts with, generally finance professionals start building the slides and then only think about what they are going to say during a presentation.
Yes, I did that probably the majority of the time that I created presentations up until the last few years, which is
Mhm.
sad that it took me that long, but just being transparent, it's a very common challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, and because you know what? It's because generally we use slides as a reporting tool as well.
Yeah,
So we prepare the slides, we send them, and then we will present them. And the mistake is to use the same reporting as a visual for your presentation. So in that case, you present something that's meant to be read in a context in which it's supposed to be just a visual backup for your talk, your presentation. And
yeah,
so this is why I have a 4 steps approach. And in my 4 steps, the slides are only the third one.
okay.
Because the first one is first to determine what is your message. What is the thing that you want people to remember when they go out of the meeting? And in that case, you'd have to realize that the message can be multiple because in your finance presentation, you cannot always have one big message, but you can have a general message with sub messages. And in all those, you have to bring the value that transform an information into an insight. And the difference between the information and the insight comes from the fact that it's not only related to the what, but you have to go further and bring the so what. That means the
Ooh,
implications, the impact, everything that can hurt the people in front of you, that they care about it, that it matters to them. And so here is the point that makes a big difference. It's an insight because they care about it. And how do they care? Because it's relatable to them. So the way to make a message an insight is to make sure that it relates to the audience you have. And then only after you decide, you determine what the next steps could be. So when you have this message, you have to go to the step 2. And the step 2 is to prepare a story. And the story will depend on the audience. Your audience can be a certain type, like, for example, experts or a marketing team, staff people who do not know a lot about finance. And you have more experienced audiences like executives, boards.
board members. Yeah,
Yeah. And they are trained. They know what finance is. That doesn't mean you have to explain everything that you did during the month, but at
right.
least you know that you do not have to patronize them and go into explaining everything in words that are
Boards
too easy.
boards can get tricky though, because if you think about it, a lot of boards, and I made this mistake early in my career. I assumed because they were a board member that they were very knowledgeable about everything. And I didn't realize boards typically are composed of experts in different areas, right? So you
Mhm.
might have several attorneys, you might have some finance people, you might have some HR experts, you might have someone that's just an industry expert, but they're not necessarily a finance person.
Yeah.
You, especially if you're presenting to boards, I've found it really pays to understand as well as you can the different people on that board so you can
Mhm.
tailor things. Okay. So second step, prepare your story. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt.
indeed. But you're totally right. And this is why the major difference between experts and boards will be not in the jargon used, because in none of those cases you want to use jargon, but it will be more in the structure of your story, whether you will start with a conclusion or not. Because those people are busy, they do not have time. You bring the conclusion and you start with that. And only when you prepared all that in your head or on paper, then you start the slides, because building the slides will be with the same structure as your story. So you will make sure that one slide has one message, and this message has been structured into your story. And this is clearly something we have to improve, because, as I said earlier, we use slides as reports. And so we use the same reports as visuals. But the thing is that you have too many graphs, too much text. And so this is not appealing when you are in a presentation. People do not
Yep.
want to read a paragraph of 50 lines, each slide with 10 bullet points and
Yeah.
five
It starts to
graphs.
look like an eye chart.
Yeah, but it hurts. It hurts the eye. And
Yeah.
after that, when you prepare the slides, well, you have to train. And today, this is in the majority of the cases not done, because we spend so much time analyzing our figures, preparing our reports, preparing our slides, that we hardly take the time to prepare us for the delivery. And the delivery can be either in person, which is my favorite context because I prefer
Same.
public speaking, but you have to adapt to the modernity, and you also need to be trained to give virtual presentations.
Yep.
And in that case, there are specifics that you need to take into account.
So let's recap here. I want to make sure I got these right.
Yeah.
So first, you want to start with what's your message, get clear on what your message is. Then you want to prepare your story.
Yeah.
Then you build the slides, and then you train or practice.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. So when you're preparing your story, I struggle with this. I'd love to get your insights on this. I started out when I first started hearing about storytelling, I heard about that classic hero's journey, right? And I thought, oh, well, all the greatest storytellers in the world use this structure.
Mhm.
So I'll use this structure. And then I realized I think there's like 13 steps. If you look at it, it's just too many,
Yeah.
right? So what is a structure that you use when you're preparing your story? What's a framework that you have found is useful?
My framework is more inspired by the consulting firm like McKinsey, Bain, BCG. It's the pyramid structure for executives.
Ah,
So you use the pyramid structure, and in those, and this is where I adapted, you bring the introduction with the opening with the SCQ way. When you started with the SCQ, then you give the main message, which is basically the conclusion, and then you detail each supporting point. Those supporting points will have to be structured with the what, so what, now what, so that people have not only the conclusion, but then each supporting evidence will be brought together with additional insights about the implications and the next steps. And after that, and this is why I start to doubt about calling it a story, because we have to remember that we are in a business environment and we are in a meeting.
exactly.
And so there are interactions. It's not only a one-to-many presentation.
Yeah, it's not a
It's,
monologue.
yeah. And so you will have moments of discussion. And this is why I try to keep the recommendations, the next steps, for after you have brought all the supporting messages, because when you have the recommendation, this is where you actually want to take off the hat of the presenter and put on the hat of the facilitator. So you become
Mm.
actually the one that's leading the conversation, but you leave the decision making process to the people in the room.
Okay, so a couple of things here that jumped out on me that I want to dive into a little bit. The what, so what, now what? explain that a little bit because it makes sense to me. But I think when I first heard that, before I learned about and by the way, if anybody wants to dive deeper into this, Google either the McKinsey pyramid principle or the Minto pyramid principle. So Barbara Minto was a McKinsey consultant who was the one that's credited for creating this framework. And you'll find like the detail. There's just a whole book about this. But the what, when we talk about what, so what, and now, what is the what?
The what is basically stating what you observed. So this is
So that
what
the answer or
90,
solution or insights.
so it's only informative at that point because you
Okay.
bring actually the information you observed during your analysis. And this is what 95% of the people do. They observed in their analysis, but what people miss is often to speak it out in business terms because
Okay.
we observed a decrease in revenues because of unfavorable volume effect. That doesn't mean a lot.
Right.
But
So,
if
but
you,
this comes, does this come, this comes after though the first statement, correct?
Mhm.
You're starting with whatever your solution or your recommendation is before you go into the what, so what, now what?
No, the recommendation goes in the end.
Okay. All right.
Indeed,
Okay.
because you bring the main message, and in those you state the question in which you say that in the end there are some proposition that we would like to that I would like to tackle with you, and I would
Gotcha.
like to
Okay.
discuss them after we see the following elements, and then you start with
Gotcha.
your supporting elements, and after you brought the supporting elements, then you are at the recommendation place.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I wanted to expand on a little bit is you made the point of shifting from presenter to facilitator.
Mm.
Again, another mistake people that are inexperienced make is they assume, well, they told me I'm going to be the one presenting. So I'm in front of the room and we think that we should be talking the whole time.
Yeah.
A presentation, or if you're the one that's delivering something, it's not most of the time intended to be like a college lecture, right? So talk to me a little bit about how you view shifting into that facilitator mode versus just presenter mode.
Well, first, it's continuous behavior you have to have in a presentation because you cannot just say, well, leave your questions until the end. I will open a Q&A session. And until then, please remain quiet because I have something to say. First, that's not
Tons of
really
people do that.
great. Yeah. But I mean,
Yeah,
if you are in a meeting, people will want to ask questions during the presentation, and that's actually a good thing if they ask questions during the
I
presentation
agree.
because
They're engaged.
that shows they listen, they are engaged, and this is what you want in your presentation to keep them engaged because the moment they stop, they disconnect, well, you lost them, and you might as well go out of the room because they will not listen to you anymore. So keep the engagement with them, and that goes through the acceptance of having questions. So those during the meeting, you have to recognize when someone has a question, and it's not just someone that will raise their voice. Some people will raise the eyebrow, some people will just be concerned and or maybe
You're
want a
hitting some great
feel.
points, man.
Yeah. And the body language of the people you have to observe. So in that case, you're already facilitating a presentation. But
Mhm.
the main point will be after you stated the supporting messages you have, you will say something about the 2 to 3 points you mentioned and say, of course, it doesn't have to be that way because there are some actions we could take and that could bring us up to X million dollars. But for that, we would need to discuss the following point. And then in that case, you made the transition from the presentation part to the discussion part. And in that discussion, you bring an option. And I really insist on saying option because you have susceptibilities in a room. And if finance come and say, this is a recommendation, we should do that, or you should do that, it's rarely well accepted. While if you come with a sort of Chinese menu and say, okay, we calculated some impacts and we would like to discuss them with you because there are some decisions you could take that could bring up to X million dollars. And then in that case, you bring point by point with the impact you assess versus the budget, versus the forecast, or versus the latest risk and opportunity. And that helps them take a decision because in that case, you're not the one saying we should do that. You're just saying, this is an option I calculated. Here are the positive and the negative impacts. And
Yeah.
here is what I assess to be versus our target. Do we do it or don't we do it? And
Yeah.
you leave the power in the hands of the deciders.
Okay, man, I've been taking notes here because I'm trying not to interrupt, but everything you're saying is cueing different questions for me.
I
So
understand.
you, if I recall correctly from a conversation we had previously, you more of your training is faced and remote. Is that right? Did I remember that
I
correctly?
prefer.
Or
I give trainings to companies in person,
Mhm.
and I prefer to do so because a large chunk of the training is about practicing. So you can practice, of course, remotely behind your screen, like we are talking today. But I prefer to have the full experience because you have the opportunity to observe the body language of the people, how they
That's what?
speak to a room, how
Yeah,
they feel when they are in front of the room. Sometimes it's easier to speak behind a webcam, but when you are in front of a room of 20 people, you start to feel the nerves, you start to sweat, you start to stutter a bit. And so those are real life elements that I like to keep. Of course, it's not always easy because I have clients in the whole world and traveling for day training is not always the best option that they prefer. And I give
right.
remote training. And in those cases, we take everything that's possible to take. You cannot do everything, but that's almost like 90% of the full experience.
So let's talk about, you've mentioned some of them already, but let's dive in a little bit here. You talked about some of the things that you pick up on, like body language and things like that. What are some specific cues that you keep tuned into that let you know that, okay, I need to maybe change up the presentation. I need to stop and ask a question, or cues that make you realize that you need to adjust something? What are some of the key ones?
Well, when it's about the audience, when I observe the body language of the audience, when I see people doing something else, that means that I clearly have an issue with my content or with my engagement skills. And so in that case, you have to consider that as a thermostat. So you observe what the heat is, what the cold is, and you decide whether you have to go a bit slower, go a bit faster, or simply give a sort of kick to make sure that the audience is still with you, connected with you. And in that
Yeah.
case, you can ask a question or ask, do you need clarification? Because I feel I lost you. So if you want me to repeat a certain point or you feel there's something you didn't understand, please let me know because my point is to deliver you the best value possible.
Yeah. So something that I want to tag on there too is if you were in the audience, because this is very important in meetings, especially, right? Not necessarily if you're going to a training, although I would still recommend this, but especially if you're, a lot of people might be on a device taking notes and actually genuinely engaged.
Mhm.
But I think most people by default, if they see you with a device in your hand, right? Like just psychologically, think about the difference between I'm in the audience or I'm in a meeting and you see me doing this. Think
Yeah.
about what your brain is assuming versus you see this. I'm looking back and forth and I'm writing,
Mhm.
right? Most people automatically assume, they don't assume I'm taking notes on my phone. They assume that I'm doing something else and I'm not engaged.
Mhm.
But if I'm holding pen and paper and I'm looking to you and I'm writing and I'm looking back and forth, it's pretty obvious I'm taking notes and I'm engaged. So if you're on the audience end of things, especially in a meeting, I would recommend that you do that versus on your phone or a device, even if that's how you take notes, because then you don't have to explain it and people will just immediately realize you are engaged and it's a good thing, right?
But
Um,
it's important to remember that it's not school. It's not
yeah,
like as a presenter, what I really teach my students is that do not play the patronizing presenter, trying to be the teacher and detect when someone is not listening. There are other ways to detect, for example, if someone is listening, because everybody takes notes with a laptop or a phone today,
mhm,
but they will look up if they really listen to you. They will nod sometime because they cannot escape these movements of the body. So there are other
yeah,
ways than just simply the fact that they are holding their phone or simply typing on their laptop. You have to realize that the body language is a bit more complex than this, but you certainly do not have to judge the people in front of you, because not only can it be quite uncomfortable for them, but it will be more uncomfortable for you, because if you think you lost them, you start to feel angry inside. And if you're angry inside, you lose the flow of your presentation.
yeah.
And eventually, it will be a
You
negative
break rapport
circle.
a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So some of the things you're talking about, I think I mentioned this to you when we talked before that a year or so ago, I started studying a lot more about body language and behavior, how to interpret behaviors. And behavior experts talk about what you just described as leakage, where there are these subconscious behaviors, right? Like you were talking about, where they're looking up, they're nodding their head, they're doing these different body language movements that sometimes they're not even aware that they're doing. And those are the most telltale signs because they're much more reliable because we're doing them at a subconscious level, right? So you'll probably, I noticed this when I've edited my podcast that I nod my head a ton because I'm listening, I'm taking notes, I'm really engaged. So that's, for me, that's one of the big ones, but you hit on a couple of other ones as well. I wanted to ask you about something where I think there's a different philosophies on this. So you talked about instead of making recommendations like the Chinese menu, giving them options and then explaining the pros and cons. And this reminds me of, I feel like I have noticed in healthcare, doctors have changed over the years, where in the past they used to just say, this is what you have, this is what you need to do, here's a prescription. And now it seems like they're much more doing what you're recommending, which is here's what's going on. Here's various different options. Here are the pros and cons. Which one of those do you feel more comfortable with?
Mhm.
Right. And so I think it's a very different philosophy because I know some people that still feel strongly like I should make the recommendation because I'm the expert. Right. And so I point this out to say, I don't agree or disagree. I think context matters. Right. The culture that you're in, the particular company that you're working with or organization you're working with, it makes a big difference because I've worked in organizations where I've been told, I want your recommendation. That's what you're here for.
Mhm.
But then I've also worked in some cultures where if I make a recommendation, they'll say, well, what other options are there? What are the pros and cons? And they'll ask because it's not that they don't want the recommendation, but they want to feel like they're more in control and they're making the decision. Different ways of approaching it. But I love the fact that you took your stand. That's the way you like to do it. Because
Mhm.
I I love having people on that they're not just, "Oh, I'm just gonna do it the way everybody else does it." You have your stake in the ground. That's the way you like to present it. And I think when you have a strong opinion about something, you're much more invested in it, right? So when I start to ask you about it and ask you why, I
Mhm.
get a lot more out of the conversation that's valuable to me. Even if I decide later, well, I disagree, I'd rather give her a recommendation. That's okay. But I'm much more educated now because we had this conversation.
Yeah, but and what's great about options is that you can always rebound on it and give a recommendation, because when you prepare your options, you obviously have your preferred one. And you can sense how the people in front of you are. You can guide them towards the recommendation that you like. And in some cases, as you say, if they ask your opinion and say, Sufyan, what do you think we should do? Well, when preparing it, you can say it and you can defend it, and it becomes your recommendation. But at least starting from the lowest, it allows you to go up. But if you already go for the recommendation, and that you will see that people feel, let's say, dubitative about that, or that they just feel you cross the line because as a finance professional, you should not be the one taking a decision. Well, at least you're ready for that.
Yeah. I think where that applies even more, and I always think about like my own personal experiences when I worked at Royal Caribbean in the planning department, I was just a financial analyst, like a staff financial analyst, right? Like 2, 3, 4 years experience. And I'm dealing with vice presidents and senior vice presidents, and sometimes having to deliver news to them about a budget cut or something like that, where I'm just the messenger, right? I didn't decide on this. The CFO decided. And in those cases, coming in trying to make a recommendation as a very junior person to a very senior person, that can be a very difficult communication versus your approach. Here's the options. Here's the pros and cons. I'm just here to facilitate. And there's certain functions that I have, but it's a very different dynamic.
Mhm.
And that kind of, I think that's a good transition into one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which is business partnering. Whether you're an FP&A, you're in a general finance role, all of those types of roles at some point are going to require you to learn how to be a good business partner. What are some elements of business partnering that you think are good skills for people to have in that sort of realm of business partnering?
Well, one of the skills and behaviors I needed to get to become a good business partner was to detach myself from the mindset of independence.
Mm,
Because starting in audit, one of the key elements they tell you is that you have to remain independent from your client. We are auditing them. So you cannot be their friend, they cannot be your family, they cannot be this and this. In that case, I understood because there was a clear
it's a clear separation.
control issue there.
Yeah.
But the thing is that you keep that mindset if you started there and if you are in accounting, because it has to remain independent. But as a partner, this is a mindset that I found quite disturbing, because you could not go as far as you wanted to as a business partner. Because I remember, like, for example, when I was working on a 3-year plan, I was helping the person in the marketing determining which volumes we were going to sell in the 3 coming years. And I prepared the model for that. And we discussed together the best assumptions to take in order to get the results. And when we got the results, I uploaded them in the system. And my manager came saying, yeah, but if you do that, that means that, sorry, if you do, that means you decide for them and this is their responsibility. And I was, no, I didn't decide for them. We decided together that this is the work I was going to do with them. And I don't want to be the postman sending the model. They put their insights and then they upload it. And I feel the work was done, because at least by doing so, I could share my view. They could share theirs. There were already some adjustments during the first meeting. So we did not have to take like 5 iterations to have the final budget. It took much less, because from the first meeting, we decided to already make adjustments so that there was marketing insights, but also finance insights.
One of the things that, as you were describing that, it reminded me, you talked about like starting as an auditor. It reminded me one of the questions that I get a lot, and I'm curious if you get this as well, is, hey, I'm in accounting or something other than FP&A, and I'm interested in transitioning into FP&A. What are some of the things I should learn or I can do experience wise to help me move from accounting to FP&A? Any thoughts on that?
Well, moving from accounting or from auditing to FP&A, the most important advice I would give, the most important recommendation is to understand that accounting must be 100% correct. You have to be 100% correct because debit must equal credit and you cannot escape it. But when moving to FP&A, you realize that it's not about being accurate because, of course, things have to be correct, they have to be complete, but it's not about that because you're mostly speaking about the future when you work in FP&A. You mostly speak about assessments, you speak about evaluations, you speak about the future trends. And so you cannot be correct because these are things that did not happen yet. So you have to take a step back from being 100% correct and accept that you can make some calculations that we call the back of the envelope calculation to take a small decision and accept that in that case, it will give you already a good idea of whether this is worth going further or not. And so many times in a meeting, you are together with a chief and he asks you for a quick calculation. You cannot just say, yeah, give me 2 weeks and I'm coming back with you.
Yeah, not anymore. 20 years ago, you could get away with that.
Today, not.
No.
They will accept. And the more you work with chiefs, the more you see how their decision making is done. Because so many times I was giving an insight about the 3-year plan I prepared, the budget I prepared. And so you see that person, okay, if we make an adjustment of a 0.5%, that gives almost, so we'll have 20 million more. And if they do that in like 1 or 2 minutes, and it will probably not be 20 million, it will be 19 million or 21 million. But this is the measuring that will give them a sense of whether this is worth it or not. And this is what they want, actually. So my biggest
Yeah.
advice going to FP&A is to take a little step back from the detail. Your work has to be correct, but the assessments you do on the future might be directionally correct.
Yeah, it's a very different mindset. There's a book called Thinking in Bets. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So the background of it I find fascinating, which is why I think it's relevant to this, which is, so Annie Duke was the author. Annie Duke was working on her PhD in cognitive science. She's studying psychology, right? And how people make decisions. And then she took a sabbatical, and her brother, who was a professional poker player, said, hey, you should try poker. I think you'd be good at it. So he taught her. She ended up winning millions of dollars, became a champion poker player. And then she went back to her psychology training and wrote a book. And she tied the two together, her study of psychology, her poker playing. And the book is all about how when we're thinking about decision making, we should think about it like bets, because decision making in the real world has more elements of gambling
Mm.
than it does of something like accounting, where, to your point, debits, credits, things work out mathematically. They're very discrete. There's right, there's wrong, there's complete, there's accuracy. But in the real world, we have to realize that sometimes we have incomplete information. We might have wrong information. We might have misinformation. And we have to sift through all that and do the best that we can to put together budgets and projections. And it's a very different mindset. So I think it's great the way you broke that down. So anybody coming from that accounting background, I think that's a good sort of framework to start with of where you might want to start.
Mhm.
thinking about that transition. We've only got a few minutes left here, and I want to make sure we respect the audience's time and obviously you and I have deadlines as well. There was an offer that you had talked to me about that you wanted to make for our audience. Before you do that though, tell us a little bit about your courses, your programs.
Yeah. For yeah, my programs, I train finance professionals. And as I said, I train mostly companies. So I work with FP&A teams. I have contacts with CFOs, and we decide on the best way forward to train their teams, mostly on the finance business partnering side, but also on the financial storytelling side. But I also want to be available for individuals because finance professionals, they do not all have teams of 10 people or 20 people. So in that case, I cannot go to on site to train one person. So in that case, I have a video training that I prepared for individual finance professionals who want to train their storytelling skills because they understand that it's important for them in their career because they know that if they want to go higher in the ladder and that they want to influence executives and people like in boards, well, I have a video training that I prepared. And yes, this is a video training that's available through all the world because it's a self-paced training. And in that video training, I also did not want to leave all the people alone. So I want the practice part to be super important. So after the 4 steps I explained earlier in the podcast today, well, people have the opportunity to record their presentation and I will review it myself and give a personalized feedback to the
Oh,
people.
wow. That's super
So
valuable.
that's the major point of that video training because I didn't want people to just watch videos and then not practicing. For me, that's almost forbidden. And then when they have this opportunity to present, they get their personalized feedback. That's asynchronized, so I cannot give it live, but I give it at another moment. And for your audience, I wanted to just give a discount that I want people to have. So I have a 30% discount if you use the discount code FPA Fast Track 30. And if you go on the website, thefinancecircle.com, you'll have access to the financial storytelling program in which you'll be able to get not only the 4 steps approach, but also the final exam with my personalized feedback.
Awesome. So, guys, if you've looked around at different training programs out there, I can tell you as someone who creates training and looks at a lot of training, personalized feedback like that is a big deal and it's uncommon. I'm not seeing that in a lot of these recorded programs. So definitely take a look at that. We'll put all the details down into the show notes so you don't have to take notes and write all this stuff down. It'll be there and it'll be easily accessible for you. If people want to reach out to you and connect with you or just ask you questions, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
The best way is on LinkedIn because I'm quite active there. So don't hesitate to ask to connect with me and we can certainly have a discussion. Or you can send me a mail to Soufyan, Soufyan, at soufbp.com, soufbp.com.
So
That's a way also to join me, and I always respond as soon as possible. But LinkedIn is my favorite one because you can have a direct chat and it's easier to get in touch.
and speaking of LinkedIn, you put out a ton of free content.
Yeah.
So for the people out there, if they want to get like a free sample, what kind of content you put out, there's a lot of it out there on LinkedIn. So they can see for themselves the type of things that they're going to be getting even more of when they take advantage of that offer that you have to go ahead and take that course. Well, man, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this. I would love to have you back another time because I have a couple of pages of notes here and I could talk to you all day with questions that hopefully will provide value to the audience. But I want to go ahead and wrap up here and remind everybody we're here, this podcast, the whole purpose of this podcast for me is to provide resources to you to help you get your FP&A career on the fast track and keep it on the fast track. And with that, thanks for your time, Sufi, and thanks for watching, you guys in the audience, and we'll see you next time.